everyone, welcome back to Series 2 of Build and Thrive. This is the podcast that is dedicated to improving the health and happiness of the construction industry. So I am your host, Jennie Armstrong, and I'm really excited to be back for our second series. We learned a lot of lessons in the first series and have put all of that effort into making Series 2 just as exciting and hopefully a little bit improved. So before we start, I just want to say thank you to our sponsors, GKR Scaffolding, who are again sponsoring the podcast for this series. So for this episode, we're going to be talking about addiction, and I have got two guests that are joining us, Nick McMurray from Positive Matters and John Fenna from Bet No More. So both Nick and John have been guests at our monthly network meeting. So we'll add some show notes and how you can join if you're interested in being part of it. Both come from a slightly different topic around addiction. And when we had the network meeting, we thought, actually, there's so many overlaps between these two subjects. Let's come together and have a conversation and obviously record it for today's podcast. So I'm going to start off by getting both of them to introduce yourselves. So let's start with you, John. John, tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit about Bet No More.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Jennie. I'm delighted to be on the podcast and following on from the network meeting. I'm John. I'm working for Bet No More UK, which is a lived experience gambling support charity and training. We've been around for about 10, 13 years. I've been working with the organisation only since the spring, basically focusing on addiction in the workplace and how we can help prevent it and support those organisations that are trying to do so. My background is I've worked for a long time in the commercial sector, including for transparency in the gaming and gambling sector. It gives me kind of an insight into addiction from a different side. Also, it's important to say that I'm what's known as an affected other. I've had a history of gambling in my family, which has affected me in some quite profound ways, which I think we might get to talk about. And I'd really like to intertwine it into stats and figures and to make things come alive, because as we found out with the charity, when we talk about things from a lived experience kind of way, it really does add a perspective, because addiction is such an individual challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Thanks for joining us. And Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jennie. Thanks for inviting us on as well. So, yeah, from Positive Matters, and background is a co-founder of that with the other business partner. And we set up Positive Matters, having both previously worked with a sort of large testing organisation. So we've seen from that side of things in terms of how that was working and that testing culture that kind of came from it. And we just felt that there was more to be done. So that hence why we set up the Positive Matters business. And our primary focus on there was more looking at a strategic approach with businesses in terms of how to make that more preventative. And we can obviously go into that in terms of more detail as we go through. But anybody that would have heard us speak before will know that how we go about building a strategy around tackling substance misuse.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Nick. I think most of the listeners, if they work in construction, will relate to the testing culture, and that's part and parcel. That's old news. We've been doing that for years, but actually this forward-looking piece is definitely where we can learn a lot from yourselves today. Okay, so let's start talking about actually how big of a problem it is. I talk about mental health in the industry. We talk a lot about raising awareness. We know the suicide rates are really challenging, and particularly in the construction industry. But let's start off just talking about actually how big of a problem it is. And so, Nick, just share a little bit about your knowledge and any interesting stats that you know about substance misuse.
Yeah, so I think when I did the last talk with you guys, we talked around the GovUK stats that had come out for 23-24. And that was really looking at people that are going in for sort of treatment for drug or alcohol support. And that was around sort of 311,000 people had actually gone through and sought, should I say, support, which was an increase of 7% from the previous year. What was interesting from that is that only 72% of those people that had gone through seeking support actually had stated that they also had a mental health need as well, which kind of shows that the two aren't siloed anymore, whereas this kind of, we're tackling sort of mental health and you're tackling substance misuse, the two often go hand in hand together. That was quite interesting. And of that 72%, 22% hadn't actually received any treatment at that point. I would hasten to say that I'm not a huge fan of stats. Sometimes it can be manipulated into how you want to do it or what messages you're trying to show. But I think those are quite hard hitting. What I really find more interesting is we went out and did some work with a non-for-profit organisation and did some research on their behalf to go out into the field and ask construction companies and their workers. And what we really found is same sort of things that you probably will know anyway, Jenny, and a lot of your listeners will know, is the main reason that people were suffering with drugs and alcohol. It could be gambling, suicide, and also mental health of themselves. But what we were really interested to see is what was stopping them from doing that. And it was that fear of, this isn't a work-related issue, this is a personal issue. And although they may know that the support was there, they didn't actually go and seek and get that support. So it's how do you bridge that gap from there? And we can all sit here and probably all come to the same conclusion, male workforce, working away from home, the pressures, the money constraints. There's a number of factors that drive people that we see from our perspective to unhealthy coping mechanisms, really, to deal with all of those.
Yeah, and I think, again, speak to anyone that works in the industry, that they always will know someone that's struggled with this. And yeah, historically, the action has been like, let's test everyone and sack them. And that's the response that we take. And actually, when we talk more about mental health, we know actually that sacking someone probably at the most vulnerable time is probably going to be, not the best outcome for that person when they're trying to get some help. But equally, seeking help is a common challenge. And John, let's come to you and talk a little bit more about gambling. So as I said to Nick at the start, we talk about drug and alcohol testing. It's been part of the parcel for industry for years. And I feel like gambling is a bit more of a hidden addiction. And to be fair, I haven't really seen any organisations do a huge amount about this, like maybe take a bit of awareness and do some kind of events. But I know when we first started talking, I shared with you that I've been involved with 3 suicides as my time as a nurse in the construction industry. 3, they're all financially related, and 2 actually were gambling related. So for me personally, I've seen the knock-on impact of that, but perhaps haven't seen the industry focus on what we can do. So share a little bit more about what you know about the stats, and particularly anything about construction.
Well, I mean, thanks, Jenny. I mean, when we talk about the stats, there's obviously the human statistics, and obviously we know the reverberation of suicide is. From the point of view of prevalence, the thing about gambling harms is, although they have a potentially very severe outcome, they're not tested for, as we know. So there's the prevalence in the United Kingdom, and the argument about stats about how many people are in sort of at risk, and the so-called problem gambling, which first of all is a term that we don't like to use. They seem quite low, I suppose. So that's why we try and think about why gambling escalates and how it can escalate, because because if you looked at it on the surface, so around 3%, 3.5% of the UK working population is at risk of gambling harms, or is gambling at a harmful level. A couple of things I'd put out there though that are quite important and maybe linked to some of the statistics we see about suicide is the 18 to 24 cohort is showing increasing prevalence for risk, and statistically is the highest prevalence in terms of gambling harm. So that's a concern, isn't it? And we've done quite a bit of work talking about things like apprentices, and we're getting to almost, if we're not looking after people in a way of a serious risk, we're getting almost into a little bit of almost safeguarding at work concerns. So what we do know, and what is a little bit, and Jenny, you're absolutely right, you've been really helpful in getting us to talk to a lot of people, is we know people are gambling at work, and it's not just construction industry. I mean, I was in Lidl's yesterday, a well-known supermarket, shall we say, and I heard two lads talking about their accumulator. A very common conversation about I'm going to put £10 on that. Perfectly normal conversation in the shop floor. We know the environment's mixed ed, male banter. Our focus really is on the fact that that's happening. Where's the underlying support or recognition that sometimes one person in that conversation, there might be 5 people around a site at lunchtime, that is not okay about it or is struggling. So basically, the stat is 27% of people, of employees, have gambled at work in the last 4 weeks. That's the 2023 stat from the Gambling Commission. That kind of feels, I almost feel like I can't believe it. I mean, I can tell you, I go to a lot of work sites, and those people at that supermarket are not in isolation. Also, every time we do a presentation, someone tells me, oh God, I had a partner whose husband had that problem, or whose wife had, every time I go in, when I go on construction sites, it happened twice on visits this year, where people say, "Gosh, we're really worried about a certain section of the employee group." So really, there's some big research that Bupa done the last year about addictions at work, and the bottom line is that gambling came in at 1% less of a challenge, at 14% of employees who have an issue with an addiction or other, as compared to 15%. So if we think about the legacy and the effort that's gone into testing, like Nick's saying, and sacking, which we absolutely would not advocate for someone with a gambling challenge any way, shape, or form, for reasons that Nick's you've got hinted at. It's very prevalent, and it's not talked about.
Yeah, and I imagine there's not the support. And I think, again, with Nick will probably talk about some of the policies and procedures. Because they do testing, they will put into the policies and procedures, we have this support program. Whether they access it or not is one challenge, but at least employers have thought about that and part of the process. And I think probably the standard response for gambling is, oh, we've got an EAP, phone this phone number, and it's not necessarily a work problem. And it was something interesting you just said there, John, about that age demographics. And I think I'll just come back to Nick. Nick, what are you seeing? I think there is this kind of recognition from a kind of alcohol use, particularly, maybe that's reducing in the younger generations, but perhaps drug taking is becoming more prevalent. Do you see any kind of factors around age that would make it more of a concern?
Yeah, we do certainly see, and it's quite broad ranging. So you'd see as you say, rightly say, the older generations may be using more alcohol as a coping mechanism, and that's entrenched in we go down the pub. And we've spoken at length as well, Jenny, about Nick O'Shea and how about that story about people getting promoted in the pub and losing their jobs. The whole lifespan is done within the pub. And I would also say that people are using perhaps declared medication or prescribed medication to keep themselves. So they're thinking, I'm doing the right thing because I'm going to work, but are they safely doing that and using prescribed medication, which may not even be for themselves, to keep themselves fit because their bodies are broken, essentially. So things like opiate-based painkillers. Certainly with the younger generation, we are seeing more your cannabis and your cocaines of this world are still used. I would also caveat that as to say that doesn't mean, once you hit 50, you stop doing cocaine and things like that. We still hear stories of people sat around sharing cocaine and of all age demographics. But yes, I would say there is that kind of natural that swing to there. But things like ketamine and that kind of use at the moment is really highly prevalent. And we certainly see that from more of a younger generation. So I think when you're looking at what your strategy would be, certainly to drugs and things like that, as John said, is knowing your demographics as your work population, you can perhaps tailor some messaging a bit more at that and make it harder hitting.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting to see it play out on a construction site. I think for both of the areas that you both address, it wouldn't be something that would be uncommon that most people would know. There's either people drinking or the gambling, but maybe not as a problem, but it's definitely present pretty much on every single site that you're going to find in the construction industry. And I suppose this is where maybe drugs and alcohol, we've known a bit more and we thought a bit more about it. Tell us a bit, Nick, about your take on how organisations need to put the right systems and things in place. And we'll see, and perhaps we'll come back to John afterwards and reflect on how that might work with gambling, whereas they're a bit more advanced for drugs and alcohol.
So I think what we kind of see is at the moment through the construction industry is this zero tolerance, and you would have heard how we advocate for a blanket zero tolerance. I don't think works very well, and that we get people sometimes coming back to us and saying, yeah, but you're eroding the safety issue, and I don't think we are. I would say that deterrence on its own doesn't work. I think you can look at it going on your building site today. There will still be people that know that it's a zero tolerance, but will still be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So it doesn't work. So that threat of losing their job isn't big enough in that regard, all the safety aspects. So we feel that real change comes from getting a balance of prevention, support, education, accountability. And then hopefully from there, that encourages better choices, obviously reduces the risks, and essentially offering an alternative to this dismissal approach. So by getting that as a blended option, that kind of helps to tackle that kind of blanket zero tolerance. And I don't think it's the bit that we're anti is people just put it up and just do it as a tick box to say, oh yeah, we've got a zero tolerance. You go on, you can underline it in big bold letters and stuff. People will recite it to you. But what does that actually mean? It's not sinking in. It's not in that regard. And that, unfortunately, then drives it underground. and it still goes on, but you just don't have that openness to come forward and ask for support.
Yeah, I think I remember a small contractor sharing with me that they didn't have a zero tolerance approach. They would tell the employees that they had a zero tolerance approach, but actually they found that when they had a worker that had failed, if they put them through the rehab and supportive program, actually they came back as a really loyal employee and were really willing to go the extra mile. There'll always be the odd ones, I'm sure, that are happy to move on and take the next job and move to the next site. And as you said, we don't have that same deterrent perhaps like the rail industry where you can't work in the rail. So it's an easy option for some people to take the risk and move on.
It's almost seen as more of an inconvenience other than a deterrent and such. So.
Yeah. John, what's your thoughts? If you had a magic wand and what you'd like to see the industry do for gambling, it's difficult because you can't test for gambling, as you've said, to say what's there. What type of things would you like to see employers actually really proactively doing?
Well, I think they had a kind of three-pronged approach about sort of the awareness and the tolerance and thinking about a prevention approach. I mean, the thing is, I actually think it's quite fundamental to gambling in that I think the risk is not manifestly understood because obviously on the face of it, there's no physical change. But what a lot of construction site managers say to me, for example, is look, it generally that's in the home. Okay, they talk about it at lunchtime. Actually, we're here to challenge that, and that's where we're way behind Nick's world in the sense that I mean, I looked at the stats for the CIB's mental health and environment report, fantastic report, and the biggest decline in kind of indicators of a health and safety risk was concentration, gambling harms and concentration, and the massive correlation between people who gamble and who gamble at work. And I talk to people almost daily in my job in that respect, in different, obviously not all of it, construction, will tell you there's the phrase present but not present because they're thinking about the next bet, thinking about when they can get to the phone again, and very often their phone is at work. So I don't think that many industries, and not only construction, really understand the power of that, as opposed to it's very obvious when someone's had a lot of drink and they're not physically able to operate a piece of machinery. But I do think we're quite far behind. I think, as you said, the prevention and awareness rounds need to. A conversation of the tool talks are great. Obviously, we'll talk about that later. But actually, I think there needs to be some risk assessment around gambling over per se, and where this ties into sort of we almost need a mandate for it, but the mandate's there because in January of this year, gambling was effectively declared a public health problem, a challenge. There was an issuance of something called the NICE guidelines, which are basically guidelines for GPs, which basically asked GPs to screen and ask where someone was presenting with a series of challenges, and not only mental health, like stress, financial, loneliness, or whole kinds of, to ask, are you or someone gambling? Affected by gambling. So if it's a public health issue, then it's obviously a work issue. I think and unfortunately, that's where I'd stop because that's where we are. And I'd love to move on to we'd love to move on to more preventative training. We've got loads of tools and things to talk about later on in the cast, but I'm afraid my three sort of endpoint would be 3A's: awareness, acceptance, and then adaptation and action. Okay, the acceptance and the awareness go together. That's kind of aware. Okay, we can be aware of it and we have a talk, but actually accepting it's happening at the workplace and accepting the risk it is key for us. And I think that's where we need to get with institutions and key bodies, training organisations. That's where we need to get to quite quickly.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm just thinking about where Nick comes from this. How do you think construction projects accept that it's a problem, or they think they assume it's okay because we test?
Yeah, and just as John was saying that, you can see me nodding away because I think exactly the same thing is in the fact that societal problems. We talk about drugs and alcohol, gambling. It's societal problems, and I think as employers, you can't just say, "Oh, that'll be okay. The NHS will pick up that," or there's another organisation. They have a part to play in this as well, and you're employing people, so there's going to be naturally problems as well. So how you, as an organisation, help and support them goes a long way to that. So yeah, I definitely think that there is more to be done, and it's not it falls on one person to fix it. I think you can all bring it together, but I think as organisations they can do more to raise awareness around around the subject.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm putting my kind of contractor hat on now and thinking, I understand where you're coming from, Nick. I understand where you're coming from, John. We accept. I'm using the language that you're trying to get, John, and to say we know there's a problem, but the balance of trying to solve that, or not solve, trying to address that with everything else that a company has to do, and from a health and safety perspective, and then from a health and well-being perspective, there's so like nutrition, sleep, there's just so many different things. And actually probably in my head again, why we wanted to have a conversation today was that maybe the whole addiction topic coming together and looking at it in a similar way means that you're covering two angles with perhaps one approach. I don't know if you've had any thoughts around, if you are a contractor, how you might be able to do some of this, or what some of the things that you might be able to do. And it's a bit of an open conversation because we've not had this together before to plan for it. I don't know, John, what do you think? Is there anything that you think from with the similarities you see that means that it could be a joined up approach?
I think the first thing I'd say is that there's a lot of competing, and we've got to be honest, and we're in the third sector, there's a lot of competing organisations who want to get a training session in, or want to, not necessarily for financial competition point of view, but because they think their message is most important. I think gambling needs to be slotted into the range of addictions. We see people in our services that have co-addictions, and that's very common. I'm sure Nick will say. I think from the point of view of training and prevention, for example, I think sharing of materials is particularly what we're seeing is people saying, look, particularly in sort of smaller organisations, people are saying we're deluged with awareness days and things to talk about, and I think we have to understand that some kind of joint sessions. I mean, we work, for example, we'd love to work with organisations like Lighthouse and have a kind of a triple or dual platform. And it's a very practical thing that would actually mean we get in front of more people and probably save the odd life more. So I think that's really quite simple. And I think part of that is, again, accepting about gambling in the family of addictions, or whatever terminology might seem right. And I think, unfortunately, that's what we have to do first. So that would be my quite simple start for that conversation.
Yeah, and like you said, there are lots of organisations that are trying to do stuff in the mental health space, and how do we upskill those organisations and understand that? But the thing that I'm reflecting on, and some of the stuff that we do at Construction Health and Wellbeing, is upskilling for like managers and supervisors. So we don't typically have like mental health first aiders and training and things like that, but we recognise that role, and actually them being able to have confidence and a bit of knowledge on these topics, similar to mental health first aiders, not to solve the problem, but know where the signposting and how to support people getting help. There's such an opportunity at that level, because, as you say, they're going to be meeting all sorts of people every single day, and how can they play that part? I don't know, what's your thoughts, Nick? Obviously, you've been in this space for a while and seen some things that have worked well. And
I think to echo what John said, it sometimes feels like you're fighting for airspace to get that in there. And as you rightly said, we all feel that our own topic, our area of expertise, so to speak, I use that with the loosest term when I say myself as an expert, because I don't. But in terms of what that means is a lot more collaboration, I think there could be, and I've talked about this before, is in terms of we haven't got perhaps the first-hand experience of going through that, but if we might have some of the tools that will actually help an organisation with perhaps, I don't know, our training or support services, but somebody else with lived experience could come in and front that, getting a blend of, you don't have to then pick one sole provider to do that. You almost put it back to what we always try and say to do with a customer is, what's going to be the right thing for the customer? What's going to help them tick off as many things as they can without it being a compliance tick box, but how do they get the best bang for their buck?
Yeah.
And if that's bringing in others, we've got a support service, but it might not be the right thing for everybody, whereas the support that John and the guys offer there at Bet No More might be better. So having that on our website, or having that on our support page to say, if this isn't the right thing for you, there's also this alternative or that alternative, kind of comes back to that siloed approach, not being, yes, we need to stay in our lane, but we can also see, as John rightly says, co-addictions exist. So it's how do we make that easy for people to talk and get support?
Absolutely. And let's just touch on the lived experience bit, because I know, obviously, John, for Bet No More, that's one of your key kind of offerings, is people sharing their experience. So how do you find that in terms of delivering messages and the impact. Now, obviously, it's impactful. I'm sure you wouldn't do it if it wasn't. But what type of things have you seen from sessions you've offered?
Well, there's a couple of things to say about that, and one of them links to kind of what Nick was saying in terms of we offer lived experience in two ways, and this is not a commercial. It's actually it's a way we operate. We referring people to our service which is called Peer Aid, where we kind of treat people and see people with people who've had that experience in recovery and addiction and addiction, gambling addiction themselves. So basically, it's peer support from someone who's had lived experience, and that's really a bit of a doubly powerful approach. The unfortunate thing is that there's no evidence to say, I've worked in many other mental health fields, and there's always kind of like RCT interventions, and there's a lot of talk about cognitive behavioural therapy versus psychotherapy, for example. We do know that people are much keener to talk to someone who's got their own life experience to get treatment. So it's a bit of a pathway because the lived experience. So we offer training and from the prevention point of view, and the policies you've talked about, and getting organisations to think culturally about what's going on in the workplace with gambling. Just even making it a thing, and then thinking about what this thing means in the sense of our attitude to it, in terms of all those kind of things. But the lived experience thing, when someone comes in and talks, a few years ago we used to have a celebrity. Now, just because it was almost like the Davina thing for menopause. Now we're finding that I can just go in and talk and open up to people, and immediately someone will associate with it because the taboo and the stigma is starting to break. The reason why gambling is so tricky, and I've kind of almost this little keys unlocked with me in the last few weeks. We've been doing a lot of filming with some of our gambling people in recovery. There's couple of things. Is people don't like, they'll talk about addictions and they'll talk about other things in their personal life, but they won't talk about their money so much. I don't know if you all kind of said we don't like to talk about how much we earn particularly. Maybe it's very British. There's one thing, and the second barrier to that is it's also about losing. So maybe we can look at it maybe from a male perspective, the construction industry, but not particularly. That's kind of shameful. So if you add those two things together, they're kind of this kind of big lock to even open up about a problem. Whereas if you ask someone about their mental health, how's your mental health lately? They're probably these days a little bit more likely to open up. So that's where the lived experience is so important, because someone's making that admission before you and in front of you. That they've done it, and it's okay, and it's really quite powerful.
I'm just thinking, but coming back to drugs and alcohol, it's almost a bit of a badge of honour. But sometimes, if you can spend all night out in the pub and get up and go to work the next day, so you've got another complication with that lived experience and the cultures and the attitudes towards it.
If you walk in and say, I've lost 300 quid on Chesterfield versus Rotherham match, you're not going to get the same response, I would say.
No, but if you've got a win, you'd soon be shouting about it, and
exactly. So that's a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's really interesting. I'm just coming back to this. If I was listening to this and I was a HR director or a health and safety manager, what are some of the things that we could do? Come back to you, Nick. I know you shared a little bit already about some of the things that positive matters, but what if you were to give them the top couple of things that every organisation should reflect on today? What would you say that would be?
The first and foremost, I would just say is don't just follow like a sheep. Like we've seen before, sometimes organisations just take a policy. They maybe even move from one business to another, and they've just slapped their name badge on the front of it and said that's our drug and alcohol. It takes a bit more thought about if you want real change. If you want it just to tick a box to get you through your audits and your site stuff, then okay, that will work. But is that actually going to address the actual issues that are going on day to day? That will be my first challenging point to people, just to actually, do you want to make that change? And then if you do want to make that change, it's then looking at how are you doing that. And I still feel that education and awareness is one of the key things that misses on there. So when we've gone out and we were doing these, I also talked about the surveys we were doing, one of the site forums said, we could probably add in 30 seconds at the end just from a site talk. And you go, really? 30 seconds? You sure you can spare 30 seconds? This is quite an important topic. This comes back to competing with the airspace. So where does it sit?
Yeah.
I think you have to give it its own. We were saying, there needs to be some cross-contamination, some cross sort of pollination across those, but you also need to carve out sometimes if it's important, like gambling, like addiction, like drug and alcohol, whatever that might be, so that they do get this thing of not just turn up on site and this is what you get as part of your site induction. Oh, by the way, we put our health and safety hat on, or I put our mental health hat on and stuff like that. The guys are overloaded, so it's trying to trying to make it that space. And then the piece that I would probably say is, from a caring perspective, is just be mindful of what's going on. So people will struggle, and just sometimes by turning them away and saying, don't come in today, just come back tomorrow, that might be their cry for help. So you almost, I think, comes to your point, Jenny, of upskilling your managers in terms of knowing how to have those difficult conversations. And it might be a headache for them, but that might be that person's cry for help. And then this ties in more to the mental health and the suicide thing of are you spotting the signs? Because they're all interlinked in some way. It's trying to understand all of that. So
Yeah.
this would be my first bit. Don't just blanket stick up a policy. Do some more carved out education and awareness, and then also look for some support and meaningful support.
Yeah, the standard, let's do a 10-minute toolbox talk, and people just reading out, alcohol and drugs will affect your ability to do your job or whatever, is not going to be the session that's going to change people's behaviour around that. Yeah, brilliant.
And it knows that. Sorry, I was going to say everybody knows that. Everybody on site. What's our approach to drug? Everybody put their hand up and say zero tolerance, and so so they know it, but.
Yeah, and behaviour changes. Yeah, if we could solve that, we wouldn't be sitting here, I'm sure. But you say the workplace is not going to be the only solution, but can be part of the solution.
Yeah.
And John, what about for you? Obviously, we've spoken about your 3 A's, but is there anything else you think, if there's one thing that you'd want someone to take away from today, to do something, to take one action, what would that be?
I think it would be, if you're talking about the HR department, which is where we started from, the point is quite about policies and things being well known and compassion, all great points. I would say, unfortunately, from the case of gambling, the HR department needs to go up to the board to talk about this issue at a higher level. Because the one thing I want people to go away from today is, I've just literally sat there looking at my feeds on stories about gambling addiction, and literally one came through, I think 2 days ago on BBC News, of a carers charity where they had to fold because some of the organisation basically took all the money. Don't be that person.
Yeah.
Don't be that CEO. Don't be that boardroom that hasn't thought about this issue at all. Because obviously we know that with drugs and alcohol you certainly have, and then there might be a bit of fatigue around that issue, but there's certainly quite a bit of ignorance around gambling. So don't let that ignorance stop you from starting a workplace conversation about that. And then start from the tool source. Let's get where Nick wants us to go with this issue. But let's get it into the boardroom and let's have some awareness sessions. I mean, sort of touching briefly on where's the funding for that, because it's yet another issue. We found that things like CSR budgets, training budgets, general training budgets, and all kinds of budgets exist in medium to or larger organisations that can be tapped into. This is all addictions are a societal problem as well, as I think we've said. They come into the workplace and people go home, but the fact that particularly gambling can be propagated in the workplace is actually, to me, leaves it even greater responsibility to not be that CEO. Don't be that CEO when the lights are flashing and you're having to answer questions about why you've lost money because your financial director unfortunately took it, or you've had someone take their own life. It's something horrendous. So that would be my one thing about this issue, because unfortunately we're still at the bottom of Mount Olympus on it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And from both of you, I think, again, with Construction Health and Wellbeing, we work with organisations on their mental health strategies. And I'm reflecting back, thinking, how much actually do we delve into these areas around these particular focuses? And I think one thing definitely I'm going to take away is actually how do we weave all of these topics as part of that prevention piece. And I know there's a bit of a call out in the industry now to say, instead of let's just keep talking about it, let's take some actions. And you've both given us some really useful things that might not solve the mental health crisis in construction and in society, but actually there are things there that you can reflect back on as an organisation and say, look, at least we're doing something to try and move that dial forward. And these type of things are going to have small impacts on the wider piece. So thank you both for your time. I just want to kind of end on a bit of a personal reflection. And I suppose that let's start with you, Nick. Obviously, you're really passionate about what you do. Just what keeps you motivated? What are some of the things that you really get out of the work that you're doing?
It's a bit kind of cheesy, but it's just the actually seeing a company that we work with or helping them. We're in this situation. How do we want to get to here, but we don't know how to get there? Can you just give us some guidance and some support and help? So one of the key things that keeps us going and why we do it, and I think I said it earlier as well, it's understanding that each business is different. So that's where we enjoy understanding different businesses that we come to. They all have their own, as I'm sure there's probably that kind of goes underneath it, but each under business. And then for me personally, it's also with a young family. I'm thinking they're going to go out into the workplace soon, so I want to try and make it a better workplace for them to go into. So I don't want them to be sacked or whatever, or just that kind of cast aside as an object. So I want them to go into feel safe to go into an industry that they feel excited about. So
Absolutely.
yeah, those are the two bits.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm sure seeing the benefits that an organisation might take by really thinking about this and the positive steps is, if you get those forward thinking organisations to be the first ones that are really taking that proactive step, you can probably measure the impact of that with productivity, engagement, all of the usual stuff that comes with health and wellbeing. And for you, John, I know you obviously, again, you're very passionate, and I've really enjoyed hearing your talks, especially at the network meeting and through the stuff you've done with some of our site contractors. But yeah, share a little bit about your personal reflections on why you do what it is what you do.
I think the thing is I'm working with people every day who have very individual stories with some, obviously some common threads, and that they've experienced this, and obviously it's quite an interesting dynamic because from my own point of view, I worked with the gambling sector for many years, so we all know that life happens, and that we have to, as a society and as people, we have to accept certain kind of behaviours. But I think and certain things that happen to us along the way that take us on the wrong path. What's so powerful about working for a lived experience charity is that everyone is so focused on not the kind of judgmental, but the kind of the outward projection of a story that is quite hard and difficult to tell, but that has a really, really transformative response when it lands, mainly because people are like, oh my goodness, I didn't realise that gambling was so powerful. I mean, the head of the NHS, when sort of giving evidence around the summertime, said this is probably one of the most powerful addictions and powerful challenges she's seen. So we've got people, I'm working with people every day who've overcome that and are turning it around to the positive. So that's super inspiring. I know it sounds a little bit cheesy, but it hasn't affected other. I wish the people that in my lives had the opportunity at the workplace, for example, not only the workplace, but another such a society to do that, to stop them gambling. And also, I also feel kind of a little bit strange in working with the sector myself and thinking it was like any other. So it's only when we think and have these internal conversations about what is this activity and what is happening. Are there vulnerabilities on people that this really impacts, that we can really sort of start to think about putting some actions into place. And I'm not surprised that construction and all industries are kind of sort of I suppose sort of on the back foot a little bit. But actually, it only takes a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of training and a little bit of experience to very quickly catch the few people, and then everyone's talking about it in a different way. So that's why I turn up every day. So maybe in 5 years' time, everyone will be talking about it in a different way. I'm sure they will.
Yeah, I think the more we're learning, the more we're hearing about the impact, then I'm sure that and as I said, I know the construction industry particularly is looking at the mental health crisis and what are some of the things that we can do, and these are, as I said, are some of the things that people can take some steps and hopefully make a small impact on some of the challenges that we have. Brilliant. Thank you both so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like there's still more we need to talk about, and again, finding ways that we can bring everything together and try and address the challenges that we have. But Nick, before we go, just share a little bit about how people can find you and if they want to get in touch.
Yeah, the website is www.positivematters.co.uk, or alternatively, I'm on LinkedIn. So if you find me on LinkedIn, it's just McMurray on LinkedIn.
And we'll put all your details in the show notes so people can just click on there. And for you, John, how's the best way for people to find you?
Sure. Well, we're part of the National Gambling Support Network, so there's a gambling support helpline, which I think will sure be on the materials, National Gambling Helpline. BetNoMoreUK.org is the website where you can find out about our training, WorkSafe being our main training, sort of prevention training program for this, what we've been talking about today. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, and we're obviously always keen to come in and give lived experience sessions to organisations that want to hear how we might better change things.
Brilliant. Thank you both. So again, just want to say a big thank you to GKR Scaffolding, our sponsors for the series. Again, we'll put all the information into the show notes so people will be able to find you. Please give us some feedback if you're doing anything in your own organisations that you think is really impactful. We'd love to bring some case studies onto the podcast and share actually some of those practical ways that we're seeing things making a difference. And just again, for all of our listeners, we keep talking about the mental health challenges that we've got. Take something away from today. Take one action that you think that might might be able to contribute to some of those challenges that we have. Yeah, and hopefully if we continue working together and collaborating, we'll start to see some improvements. But thanks again for today's show. Please give some feedback and remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.